Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk. My lab focuses on vocal learning and communicative development in songbirds and human infants. We study parents and infants together as a co-evolved and a co-developing system. Our central findings show that young birds and babies learn new vocal forms when the social reactions to their immature vocalizing, babbling in babies and plastic song in birds, are when those reactions are contingent and close in time to the vocalizations. So this means that immature vocalizations, which are long regarded as meaningless motor practice, actually have real functional significance for the development of communication, but only when you study babbling in social context. So the research I'll present today focuses on the role of social learning in the acquisition of phonological patterns. And this perspective has revealed new mechanisms of vocal learning and development. So I'll start off by showing you some details of vocal development over the first year. So taking a closer look, the earliest sounds, these are non-cry vocalizations that babies make, are quasi-resonant. They're nasalized, they tend to be very creaky. And the sonogram, which is the first syllable of the sound I'm about to play you, has a lot of broadband noise in it, as you can hear. Now, in contrast, by around 4 or 5 months, we start to see more full resonance in those sounds. So now the upper vocal tract is participating in the shaping of the sounds. We get vowel differentiation. And here's an example of that. And you can see in the sonogram that the fundamental and first formant are much more distinguishable now. Moving forward, vocal development in the second half of the first year is characterized by changes in consonant vowel articulation. So marginal syllables have slow transitions, usually over 250 milliseconds, between the consonant and the vowel, so much so that the vowel is often distorted. Here's an example. And finally, canonical syllables meet all of the acoustic requirements for well-formed adult speech. So from the earliest precursors, by the end of the first year, the infant's repertoire will consist mostly of fully resonant vowels and canonical syllables. And so in contrast to that first sound I played you, this canonical syllable is going to have a very rapid and well-timed transition from consonant to vowel, moving to a fully resonant vowel, as you can hear. So that's the kind of sound you might find in an early word. So what mechanisms cause babbling to become more and more speech-like? What work is out there really emphasizes the maturation of the articulators as the most relevant factor in vocal ontogeny, sometimes the only relevant factor. But a number of studies show that the phonological patterns of babbling come to resemble those of the ambient language by around 10 months. So how does it get there? The mechanisms underlying early vocal learning haven't received that much attention. So to study vocal learning in social contexts, I started with looking at parental responsiveness that I'll summarize briefly for you. We wanted to know what kind of social sounding board infants might have. So based on my earlier birdsong work, we first investigated caregivers' responsiveness to babbling. And in a series of studies using playback paradigms, we found that caregivers of 9-month-old infants showed significant agreement when reacting to the babbling of unfamiliar infants that were highly controlled stimuli. So with Rachel Albert, we found that more speech-like sounds obtain stronger responses from adults, both in terms of movement and speech, and more caregiving experience predict higher selectivity of responses. With Stephen Elmlinger, we recently found that parent speech that's contingent on babbling has a much simpler linguistic structure than their non-contingent yet infant-directed speech. So contingent parental speech was less lexically diverse and it was shorter in utterance length than non-contingent speech. So the next question was whether infants could learn from caregivers' consistent responses to their sounds. So we've been investigating vocal learning over the first year, and today I'll focus on a type of learning that we've documented in 8 to 9-month-olds. So we use a controlled experimental setting. This is going to be characteristic of the studies I'll show you for the rest of the talk. We use a particular paradigm to ask whether infants can use social feedback to guide their vocal repertoires. And so the first study I'll show you, we had moms and babies come into the lab. We manipulated mothers' interactions with their infants to see if there would be an impact on the kinds of sounds their babies would produce. And this study had 69-month-olds and their mothers. They came in for 2 visits. The first one being a familiarization. By the way, I use 9-month-olds because like what I just showed you with vocal development, they're really in a transition phase. Their vocal repertoires often include all 4 of the acoustic forms that I just described to you. So when they come in for that first visit, it's just a 30-minute familiarization period. It lets the moms and babies time to get used to the room. And then in the second visit, we test the impact of changes in maternal behavior on their infant sounds. So for that second visit, the first 10 minutes, again, it's just baseline. We ask mothers to play like they would at home. We get a baseline level of infant vocalizations and vocal types and maternal responsiveness. During the second 10-minute period, we ask mothers to play again, but we give them instructions on top of that. And we have the mothers get instructed to respond contingently to our infant sounds. The responses to the second half were yoked to those of the first half, and I'll explain that more in a moment. Then during the last 10-minute period, we instruct mothers to again play like they would at home. So we're extinguishing the response contingencies that we set up in the previous period. And throughout all of this, we're analyzing the rate, the resonance, and the consonant vowel articulatory timing of babbling. The testing room is a pretty big room. It's like 15 by 20 feet, and it has toys and pictures to make the environment as natural as possible. The reason we use a big room, by the way, is to allow the babies to get away from their moms if they want to. They're not locked into a social interaction here. There's a toy box. They can crawl around and do whatever they want. You might notice that mom's wearing some headphones here. I needed to be able to give her instructions in a way that wouldn't disturb her babies. We don't want the voice of God coming over a speaker on the wall or anything like that. So I had moms wear a lightweight wireless headphone. We use earbuds now too. The headphones don't obstruct her hearing of outside sounds, but they do keep the infants from hearing my communications with the mothers. And each infant wore a set of denim overalls into which we'd sewn a lightweight wireless microphone and a transmitter, so we get high quality sounds. Now, during that middle 10-minute period of the manipulation, the social response period, as we call it, I instructed each contingent mother to respond by smiling, getting closer to, and touching her infant. And these behaviors are based on what we'd observed in lots of previous recordings of mother-infant interactions. But very importantly, we need to separate the effects of stimulation caused by mother's responses from the contingencies of her actions. So we ran a control group that experiences the same procedures, but with one exception. In the social response period, we yoke the mother's responses to those of a randomly selected mother from the corresponding contingent group that we'd already ran. So if a mom and a contingent mom, we had, let's say her baby babbled at 1 minute and 47 seconds, and I had mom respond right then to make her contingent. Well, when this new baby and mom come in, because they're yoked to the first set, at 1 minute 47 seconds, I'm going to have that mom do that response, even though her baby very likely did not just babble. So the control infants received the same amount and type of stimulation as those in the experimental group, but the stimulation is not contingent on the vocalizations. Okay, so overall, we've done a bunch of these vocal learning studies. I'm going to give you a brief summary of those, then we're going to get into detail on the ones that I think indicate infants' ability to do statistical learning and vocal production. So over a series of these studies, we found that contingent interaction facilitates real-time acoustic changes in babbling, and it moves sounds towards mature forms. And different studies with different manipulations have shown different aspects of vocal learning. So contingent but silent responding results in general increases in more advanced sounds. We get more fully resonant vowels, more complex syllables, that is syllables with consonant vowel structure to them, and more canonical syllables. However, if mothers respond with speech, infants will actually learn the sound order or their phonological patterns. So for example, as I'll show you, infants given resonant vowels as feedback will increase the proportion of sounds that are fully resonant. Infants given words as feedback will increase the proportion of sounds with consonant vowel structured syllables. They aren't using the same phonemes they heard as feedback, but they're learning the underlying patterns of speech. So we wanted to take a closer look at that. And so in this study, during the social response period, I instructed each mom to respond by smiling, getting closer and touching her infant, like I said earlier, but here we run 2 groups. They differed in terms of what mothers said when they responded. In the resonance group, we asked mom to produce fully resonant vowel sounds. In the consonant vowel group, we asked mothers to respond with a word. So these infants would hear consonant vowel alternations. We basically asked the moms, if the babble was a word, what would that word be? Say it back to your infant. while you're getting closer and touching them. Again, this is all happening in that middle 10 minutes, that social response period. So the first thing we did was analyze maternal responses to their infant sounds. Here you can see the proportion of sounds that are responded to in each of the 3 experimental periods, the baseline, social response, and baseline 2. Contingent mothers in the resident group, that's the yellow line, they're able to follow instructions. Compared to baseline, they respond to a significantly greater number of sounds in the social response period, then they come right back down to baseline levels. The yoke control mothers stayed at similar levels over all 3 periods. And we see a similar pattern in the consonant vowel mothers. They're clearly able to follow the instructions. So how did this manipulation of social contingency affect infant vocal learning? Well, to assess that, we first looked at the resonance of the sounds produced. And this is around 1,500 vocalizations. In the resonance group, mothers were using long, fully resonant vowels, even when the infants' vocalizations were quasi-resonant. So infants in the contingent resonant group, again, the yellow line, showed significant increases in the production of fully resonant sounds from baseline to social response. And then they stayed at a similar level through the second baseline period. The yoke controls, the red line, didn't change. Interestingly, in the consonant vowel group, we don't see changes in resonance. We only got it in the infants that got examples of resonance. Okay, what happens when we look at complexity? Again, this is the proportion of syllables with consonant vowel structure to total vocalizations. Babies in the resonance group, the ones getting just vowels, they did not change the proportion of consonant vowel structure sounds they produced. However, in the consonant vowel group, here the mothers are responding with words. The babies hear many syllables with consonant vowel structure. These babies increased the proportion of syllables that had consonant vowel structure. And they stayed at a similar level throughout the second baseline period. At the same time, yoke controls didn't show changes in the complexity of their sounds. So in sum, we found specific learning effects here. Infants given resonant vowels as feedback increased the proportion of sounds that were fully resonant, and infants given words as feedback increased the proportion of sounds with consonant vowel structured syllables. So what accounts for these patterns of change? The traditional explanation is vocal imitation. So what we did is to assess the degree of infant matching of their mother's utterances. We phonetically transcribed each sound made by the infants and mothers. For each dyad, we paired mother's speech sounds with the infant vocalization that immediately followed. And then to calculate the chance level of matching, we randomly shuffled the sounds to create a new set of random pairings. And you can see here in the resonance group, they were not significantly different in terms of their observed matching and the chance level. And in the consonant vowel group, again, they're right at the same chance level. By the way, there's many more possible combinations of consonants and vowels than just vowels. So you see the chance level being lower for significant matching in the consonant vowel group. So the kinds of sounds that contingent infants are producing, they share the underlying phonological patterning. Make resonant vowel sounds, or you make consonant vowel articulations. But they didn't share surface level phonetic characteristics with their mother's speech. And that means to me that vocal learning is a non-imitative process. They're not mimicking the surface features. So the infants seem to be picking up on statistical regularities in their mother's speech, such as the phonological patterns of resonance and consonant vowel alternation, but not on the surface characteristics really of specific phonemes like ba versus t that their mothers might say. Also, data from the yoke control groups indicates that the timing of feedback is critical here. Mere exposure to their mother's vocalizations is not enough to get the babies to change their sounds. So these data suggest that contingency is crucial for vocal learning. Now, to really investigate a possible statistical mechanism, we really need to control the input frequencies and use novel phonological patterns so we don't have to worry about prior exposure. And that's what we did next. So in this study, to look at the learning of new phonological forms, we presented infants with sound patterns that they're capable of pronouncing, but they typically don't say in an ambient English linguistic environment. So we use as feedback words from the Nigerian language Yoruba. Yoruban words, typically addressed to infants usually have a vowel consonant vowel form. And by 10 months, these infants' dissyllables tend to be vowel consonant vowel in structure. So they'll say Abba, In contrast to infants in an English linguistic environment, will be doing a CV. So instead of Abba, they'll say Baba, which is what we typically hear here. So using the vocal learning paradigm, we had mothers respond using Yoruban words to see if infants could pick up this vowel, consonant, vowel syllable pattern. And I'm going to play you an example. You're going to hear 3 Yoruban utterances. The first is the experimenter cueing the mom to respond to a vocalization the baby had just made before the clip started. Then you're going to hear the mom say the Yoruban word. Then you'll hear the baby.
Ika. Ika.
So you notice that the infant's utterance shared the same phonological form, but not the same surface level phonemes as his mother's speech. And that's going to turn out to be important. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the multiple kinds of input conditions we used. We ran 3 groups that differed in terms of the variability present in the input. So the learning mechanism we think at work here is statistical learning. That's a process of extracting regularities out of variability in the input. So we hypothesized that if statistical learning was a mechanism of phonological development, infants would learn that vowel, consonant, vowel pattern from the variable exemplars spoken by their caregivers. However, if they learned by mimicking, then variable exemplars would make learning really difficult. We also, in a separate group, had a repetition group, also contingent, but the same Yoruban word every time. So if there's no variance in the input, then the surface features are as salient as the underlying pattern. So learning, and especially generalizing a vowel consonant form, should be very difficult. However, if infants are learning by imitating, by mimicking those phonemes, then they should do better in the repetition condition, as the surface features of the words are most salient in that condition. And of course, for both of these contingent groups, we ran yoke controls. So on to the data. This graph shows the proportion of vocalizations that had Yoruban vowel, consonant, vowel form. And again, our 3 periods at the bottom. And it's the social response period in the middle when we do the manipulation. You can see that infants in this contingent high variability group, that's a different word each time, they showed a significant increase from baseline to social response, which was maintained at a similar level through the second baseline period. Now, in this group, the pattern of phonological change is similar in magnitude to the resonance and consonant vowel changes I showed you in the earlier studies. Infants, in contrast, in the contingent but low variability group, that's the same word each time, they didn't show changes in their production of vowel, consonant, vowel sounds. Our yoke control groups also did not show changes in their vocalizations. Now, looking across conditions, they're not different in vocal production at baseline, and there's a significant interaction between group and period. To give you a more direct comparison across conditions, this graph shows mean change from the first baseline to the social response period and the proportion of infant utterances that had Yoruban phonological form. Only the infants in the contingent 100% variability condition changed the proportion of babbles that had Yoruban phonological form. Those are the babies that got a different word each time. So again, we asked if infants were learning by imitating or by statistical learning of the underlying form. Learning the VCV pattern would be evidenced by infants generalizing it to new phonemes when they produced vocalizations that had that Yoruban form. So when we paired mothers' Yoruban exemplars to the infant vocalization that immediately followed, we again found that they did not match more often than chance. To us, that means that infants had learned the underlying vowel, consonant, vowel pattern, and they're generalizing it to new combinations of sounds. So to further investigate the effects of variability in the input on learning, we're running with Stephen Ellinger groups that receive 25, 50, or 75% variability in the Yoruban input. We're really interested to see if graded input yields graded learning or not. So we call this phenomenon socially guided statistical learning. The infants are picking up on statistical regularities, that is, high probability patterns in their mother's speech, such as the phonological patterns of resonance and consonant vowel alternation, but they're not picking up on the surface characteristics of specific phonemes like ba versus d that their mothers use. They're not mimicking those. So as in the first study I showed you, data from the yoke control groups indicate that the timing of feedback is again crucially important. Mere exposure is not enough to get them to change their sounds. So contingency, as well as the vocal form, is crucial for vocal learning. Now, this kind of finding in a way stands in contrast to study of statistical learning and speech perception, the classic work by Jenny Safran, Rebecca Gomez, and many others. In those, infants don't need contingent presentations of stimuli in order to learn. So why is contingency important here? Well, first, the vocal production task is harder because babies are creating rather than just recognizing utterances that obey phonological rules. Pat Kuhl, Kathy Tamas-Lamanda, and others have argued that social contingency benefits learning because it helps focus infants' attention and it provides richer sources of information. So in the lab, we're currently testing some candidate mechanisms of this. During contingent feedback, we know that infants and mothers' utterances were close together in time, which may have made disparities, acoustic disparities, between the infants and adults' productions more salient to the baby. So infants, like many songbird species, might use a mechanism of correlation between their own and others' utterances to structure their vocalizations along the most salient dimensions of adult speech and minimize prediction error. In addition, we think that certain characteristics of interaction, such as infant-directed speech, but here contingent timing, are more predictable and rewarding to infants. Reward pathways may mediate the saliency of information like speech that's associated with a rewarding interaction. So here is the basic motor circuitry of language in gray and its interconnectedness with reward centers that might serve a social gating function. The basal ganglia thalamocortical loop consists of projections to and from laryngeal motor cortex and striatal regions. Now, the striatum is involved in the control of speech motor output, and the importance of this region in vocal control and speech control has been further supported by recent studies showing its association with syntactic and semantic processing. Now, reward and motivational pathways activated during social interactions, very predictable interactions, may influence the processing of speech and language that's in those interactions. So positively valent social offense might serve as sort of a metadata tag that gets attached to co-occurring statistical regularities in that ongoing speech. So conceptually, similar ideas about social gating of human communicative and linguistic development have been raised by Pat Kuhl and others. So this social feedback loop that informs early language learning, it's organized by immature vocalizations. It might be supported by a neural feedback loop that connects reward processing in basal ganglia with more cortical areas that are responsible for learning and processing vocalizations. Now, in my songbird lab, we're investigating these ideas about the neurobiology of socially guided vocal learning. And the experiments we're running with songbirds are directly informed by the findings I've just showed you from our human infant studies. Now, this contingency-driven vocal learning, I mentioned the feedback loop a second ago. I want to show it to you. It's embedded in that feedback loop. So years of work in my lab and others, including Anne Warlamont's, has shown that the reactions of caregivers to babbling affords infants opportunities to learn more advanced sound patterns. So the feedback loop looks like this. So in the playback studies that I summarized for you in the beginning, I found that mothers are responsive to prelinguistic sounds. Vocalizations that are fully resonant or contain canonical syllables are the most likely to influence mothers' behavior. We've just seen that infants' vocalizations are highly sensitive to regularities and caregivers' contingent responses, and infants modify their vocalizations in exactly the ways that in my playback studies, they cause mothers to use sounds, more likely to use sounds as cues when reacting to infant behavior. And as this process continues, it affords infants structured and predictable feedback for their vocalizations, feedback that influences the acoustic structure of their babbling. So by babbling, they can make the social environment more predictable. And at the same time, parents are giving the infants linguistic simplified speech. This is really setting the stage for socially guided statistical learning. So to sum up, the reactions of caregivers to babbling affords infants opportunities to refine their vocal repertoires. Infants learn how to make well-formed syllables, and they learn how to order those syllables as a result of social feedback. The kinds of phonological patterns that are learned depends on the contents of mother's speech, those underlying patterns during contingent interactions. So I view this as a pretty good demonstration of statistical learning in vocal production. by infants. And statistical learning is a mechanism by which social feedback facilitates early vocal development. And we're now focusing on how these patterns of moment-to-moment interactions change over developmental time, how the complex contingencies that emerge map onto the perceptual capacities of young learners. And I'd just like to thank Jennifer Schwade and Stephen Elminger, who have been crucial collaborators on the work I showed you today. I want to thank my other graduate students in the lab, both on the bird and the baby sides, and of course, our many undergraduates on our bird and baby teams. I also want to acknowledge our funding sources from NSF, from NICHD, and from the Institute for the Social Sciences here at Cornell. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to chatting with you in the live Q&A later today.